Before the start of the latest pop culture primary source dissection, I want to turn your attention to the show's Patreon and Substack pages. Becoming a patron at patreon.com/EPS podcast is the surest way to show your financial support for the show, with membership tiers beginning as low as $3. I would go even lower, but Patreon won't let me. By becoming a member, you receive early access to show content, and depending on the level, exclusive offers such as being a guest on the show and determining the next topic to be addressed. The Everything is a Primary Source over at substack.com is also a source of extras, most notably the second halves of episodes. It is also where show notes are located, as well as essays about pop culture and history and pop culture. And now, on with the show. Dungeons & Dragons has seen an uptick in exposure these last few years, thanks in large part to its heavy presence in the storyline of Netflix's Stranger Things. Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves, the latest film based on the role-playing game, premieres in the United States on March 31st, and by looks of it, the new film will approach the story differently than previous film adaptations. With a more comedic take on the title, Honor Among Thieves appears to honor the spirit of D&D that players have fallen in love with for almost 50 years. To get the inside scoop on Dungeons & Dragons, I turned to Rob Vader, one of the hosts of the We Met in a Tavern podcast, who I actually did meet in a tavern a few months ago, a show dedicated to talking about the latest characters and quests over a satisfying craft beer or two. He and I discussed how the development of the game and its growth in popularity are indicators of the 1970s from which it came. We also look at the controversies the game has induced in its early years and how that, too, is very telling of the society and values of the 1980s. I'd like to welcome you all back to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm Eric Paul, and today I'm being joined by Rob Vader, who is one of the hosts of We Met in a Tavern podcast. And coincidentally enough, Rob and I did meet in a tavern a few months ago. I was doing one of my live podcast karaoke's at Loaded Question in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I was on my way out and you were on your way in, and we got to talking, and 4 months later, here we are. So welcome to the EPS podcast.
No, thank you so much for having me.
So give us a quick once around of what your podcast is all about.
Of course. Yeah, so We Met in a Tavern was started like many podcasts during the that lovely era of COVID, where I felt like I needed some form of creative outlet. But it was derived from the concept of I play Dungeons and Dragons with my friends. I consume a lot of Dungeons and Dragons content, and just knew that there was part of it I loved more than the rest, and it was the role play and the discussion with my friends about their characters after the games, about things that maybe we didn't see at the table. Mm-hmm. And I thought it would be great to have essentially an hour-long discussion with my friends over a drink where we talked a little bit more in depth about their characters, what they were thinking, and their motivations. And it has evolved from there, and I've talked to people from as far away as Australia about their characters, and it's been wonderful.
That's such a clever idea, and it's so. I'm assuming that the game itself, well, maybe for a younger audience, not so much, but for an older audience, it definitely kind of calls for beers, and having some kind of, because it has that medieval feel to it of taverns and having ales and stuff like that being clinked together with big tankards of something inside. So
of course, I mean, you can't drink water in those times. The water is tough.
Yeah. So and what we do, and so I'll tell you my Dungeons and Dragons. I have one experience with it, and it was as far as playing it, and that was a couple years ago with a friend of mine who actually has been on my podcast a few times. Her name's Audie, and she's an author. And so it was like she played as the dungeon master, and then she went easy on us because my wife and I, we had never played before. So she walked us through it, and she's an author, like I said, so she has like that storytelling, she's really good at making stories go as along. One of my favorite components of it was the character creation part. Like, I love just sitting down and starting with the different, and like doing a little sketch of it on the pad, and writing all your attributes and stuff like that. What is your favorite part of playing D&D?
So honestly, and again, it's why I made the podcast, is very much that. I have for anyone who uses the digital tools, I use a website called D&D Beyond, which is now like an official partner of Wizards of the Coast. But I have more characters on that account than I can count. Like, it's a problem. Like, I just randomly, and I have an idea, and I'm like, oh, this would be a great character, and the sin is I don't get to play half of them, and I dungeon master myself now. So part of wanting to do the podcast, and what I love about D&D, is creating characters, talking about people's characters, and just getting into that like minutia around the role play, because it really does, like, the simplest things, such as like deciding to attack an enemy, can really come down from a role play perspective. Like, sure, there's game mechanics, and I love strategy games and video games, but there's also like, this is probably the wrong decision from a strategy perspective, but my character cares about this, so I'm gonna do it. And I don't know, I love digging into that, and I love thinking about that.
It's like acting in a way. You're kind of putting like your own, like you put your character's intentions before your own. And that might be part of the reason why a lot of people over the years have gotten into D&D. So what we do on my podcast is we break down things that are not usually considered to be historic artifacts. In this case, a game. I don't want to just simplify it by calling it a board game, because I think it's more than a board game. A strategy game, first-person role-player game. We're going to be taking this game, we're going to break it down to its essentials and see what it can tell us about, I would say, when it first came out, which is the mid-1970s, but it seems to have, it really found its way into popular culture, maybe infamously in the 80s, where it seemed to get a lot of negative attention. But we can address all those as we go through the primary source question. When it comes to analyzing a podcast, when it comes to analyzing a primary source, we can start pretty much anywhere on this form. But when designing this, I start at the top with the material it's made from. And by that, I mean, not necessarily the physical material, but where did the idea come from initially? What was the basis for Dungeons and Dragons? In, what was it, 1974 or so when it came out?
No, 1974, and I will say I was intimidated to be on the podcast, primarily because I'm what I would call a history minor, but I never wanted to take research methods, so I just kept taking 4,000 level history classes instead. So I have about the same history background as like a true history major. I just I never got any of the paperwork to go along with it. But so primary sources, secondary sources, like these are things I love talking about.
Good, okay.
So I did my research again beforehand because I stumbled into D&D pretty late in life. But yeah, so 1974, and it was made by Gary Gygax, and I cannot remember his partner's name in it, but it really stemmed from, they played a lot of war games. So true on strategic battlefield-esque games where there are rules and structure, and they created Dungeons and Dragons in a sense to kind of make that into like a fantasy realm, to give it a little bit more of a storytelling perspective, which isn't something that exists in war games as much. So I think it stemmed from war games, but wanting to add a little bit more flair to it and have it not be so just so rigid, and like add a little bit more storytelling. It also came at a time where like high fantasy was starting to come back into the main sphere, and it takes a lot of especially if you look at the old lore, it takes a lot from like Tolkien and that era.
So it kind of matches up pretty well with, I would say, the time period, because I think about the imagery, like you said, about high fantasy type stuff. It seemed like that matches up. Like in music world, there was a lot of like the early heavy metal groups that were showing up, and they were decked out in what could only be described as almost like knight's armor, like leather, bracelets with, I'm thinking like Judas Priest. I'm
Yep.
thinking, there's like this kind of, just kind of not facade, like a cosmetic appearance that existed in late 60s, early 70s that dive back into the, just kind of like a general medieval, right? Not even like a specific time or place in the past. Now, I was doing some research on my own too, and it seemed like there was a game that Gary was involved in called Chainmail, which was a war game as well. And that one seemed to be actually rooted in real history. Whereas, do you think Dungeons and Dragons, that was intentionally involving things kind of fantastic as a way to give itself a bit more, and its players a bit more liberty with their imaginations, instead of just saying, okay, you have to stay within confines of reality. You can't, be, this is the Third Crusade. You have to behave like it's 1215, is there anything to that, you think?
No, I do, and I mean, at the time itself, specifically, like just in the early '70s, I mean, escapism is kind of a pretty big thing. We're getting out of a lot of dark times, and just finding a way to kind of avoid living in those times at all, and just being able to explore kind of the more fantastical and uh, honestly, psychedelic drugs, etc.
Right.
But like, getting a little out of your own body and moving into this creative space was definitely a thing that was happening. I think even to this day, it's part of the reason why that people still dive back into it. The taking imaginative liberties and kind of escaping the day to day and being in a little bit more of a fantastical mindset is it's a lot of fun, but it also just puts a lot of it's a different stressor that I don't think we get every day.
Right. I've seen, like I said before, I've played it once, but I've definitely known people who play it more habitually. Like when I was in college, there was a group of guys in my dorms who met, probably once every week, I would say, and they would be sometimes up pretty late. I was an RA and I was doing my rounds at like 1 a.m. and they would be, and I remember one time coming across, they were in one of the common areas in the dorm, and I was like, one guy was like, his head was, he was against like the window and he was like pounding it like he was all mad, and somebody else is just kind of like, and I'm like, what is going on? And I asked one of the guys later because I was friends with one of them, and he's like, oh yeah, it was just a campaign that went, he's like, he made it seem like, you know yeah, you kind of have to be doing it to understand, but um there is a commitment to it, right? It's not as simple as like Monopoly, where you're just gonna, play and be like, all right, I'm tired of this. Like, you really kind of have to find your way through it. You have to problem solve. You have to story tell. You have to maneuver and navigate. And like you said, I think that matches up pretty well with, especially the youth of that time period, the '70s and the early '80s. In a lot of ways, that the kids and teenagers of that era were kind of cast out to deal with things on their own, like adult type problems, but, on their own. And so, and not a lot of adult supervision because mom and dad were both at work, or maybe it was just mom or just dad that they lived with. And so, they were in their basements playing this game and just kind of using the wits that they would have to use in real life to do well in this game. So I don't know if that summarizes or gives any kind of, if there's any credibility to what I just said, but that's kind of the way I take away from it, is that it's not a straightforward game. It's one that you do get deeply involved in.
No, it really, really is. And in the same way that you were talking about your your dorm mates, like there is this. It's hard to explain to some people because if they've never played or they never experienced like a role playing game, I don't think they might not get it. But the way that our brain forms memories when you imagine things, so this happens a lot for writers, but that's activating those same areas of your brain. So if you're playing this game where you're all imagining a scene together and these things are happening and you fail, that gets stored in your memory bank just as solid as if, like you did really bad on a test at school.
Right.
And yeah, and in the same way, those successes, like to this day, there are things that happen in our games that I think me and my friends are like, we'll talk about as if we all did. Like, oh, can't you remember when we saved the cat? Like that was such a big deal. And like, we remember those things. But I do really think it has a lot to do with that time period in those, where the youth was finding their outlet, honestly.
And was that one of the reasons why it got bad press, was because kids were getting into it so emotionally and so heavily into it that their parents were fearful that they were going to be either consumed by the game or so taken by the game that it would distract them from things that their families wanted them to care about, like school and church and, all the traditional outlets. Is that where it started to get some of the negative connotations?
Yeah, from what I understand of it, and honestly, like the transition from the 70s into the 80s it's a really interesting time period. The Satanic Panic in general is just it's a lot, and I think it's a mix of in the 70s there were a lot of fairly young parents who kind of got into it. They had kids. They did this traditional have 2 to 3 kids, and then when the oldest gets to a certain point, they take care of the younger ones, and then you kind of go off and you do your own thing. Mm-hmm. But then when we got into the 80s and some different things were happening in pop culture, this fear that their kids weren't doing what they should be doing, that they were involved in these in illicit drugs and cults, etc., started coming out. And Dungeons and Dragons, unfortunately, it was a game played by like a counterculture. It was for lack of a better term, nerds played the game. People who might not fit in everyday society, which I mean, it's the perfect game for them. It's just so great. You can be who you want to be. You can do what you want to do, and you don't have to feel like you're being pulled down by outside factors.
Right.
But suddenly when you start looking at the pattern of like, okay, these 6 kids who don't talk to anybody else are now getting together in a basement and they're getting all excited and they're cheering. And then you look at the book, and the book talks about demons and devils and things, and like completely out of context if you actually read any of these books. Like it's it's like, oh no, most of them are like holy avengers fighting against these beasts.
Right.
But you start putting those pieces together, and it's a terrible way to say it, but like the parent who might have been a little absent for a bit is suddenly looking at it and it's like, this is what my kid's involved in, and you kind of do the overcorrect. And I think that's where a lot of it came from, this fear that like they hadn't been as involved, and now they're so scared their kid's doing something even more dangerous than they could have imagined.
Because it was so brand new. I mean, at least for 20th century, mindsets, was this idea of getting involved in that kind of, dark, grim, storytelling with danger and magic and all that kind of business. That, I could imagine that, because parents of kids in the 80s were themselves kids in like the 50s. And so there was nothing like that, at least not mainstream in the 50s, that they would have had access to. And just like that push of mass media, that wave that had started at the beginning of the century was really, I don't even think it was fully cresting in the 70s and 80s. It was still building and building and building. And so it's kind of funny. It's almost laughable now. And I don't know if you saw the most recent season of Stranger Things, because it's one of the places where that Dungeons and Dragons is very well represented in media nowadays. But the Hellfire Club in the most recent season, their leader kind of has a monologue in that in the cafeteria in the first episode or so, where he is reading from the magazine, I think it's like Newsweek or something like that, about the dangers of Dungeons and Dragons, and he starts like getting really into it. and we kind of laugh at it. It was made, for the 2020s, Stranger Things was. So we're kind of chuckling, being like, people were afraid of this. Like, they had no idea what was coming down the pike, in the 90s and the 2000s with the rise of the internet. Dungeons and Dragons at that time was self-contained, right? It was. So maybe you can just give us a little bit of like a quick version of how a gameplay actually goes. There are some components of it that are universal, right? Like everybody playing is using some of the same things, but then there is some things, other parts that are totally exclusive to the group actually playing it.
No, of course. So, like, just like any game, there are rule books. We like to call them guidebooks because at the end of the day, where you're talking about narrative storytelling, things are guides a little bit more than they are like strict. But we do have so there's a book for players, there's a book for the dungeon master, and those are kind of your big ones. A standard game, your dungeon master is in control of the adventure, at least the major set pieces that are going to be there. Think of them as the author, but I would use that term very loosely because everyone at the table is going to have a lot of influence over where the story goes.
Okay.
But again, actually, they're more like a stage director. So they're going to make sure that the pieces, they know when the pieces should come out and what pieces you're going to be interacting with. And then everybody at the table, each player has a player sheet, which has a fair about 6 stats on it. Those stats like strength, charisma, constitution, which is like your health. You've got those stats, which will then affect rolls that you make. And when I say rolls, you have a set of very varied polyhedral die. So anything from your standard Monopoly dice, like a D6, all the way up to a D20, which is 20-sided dice. Oh, the D20 is like that is your number one die in the game. But we also have something as small as a D3, which looks like a little triangle. And if you ever thought like stepping on a Lego piece is bad, try stepping on a D4. Like a D4 is awful. So you'll essentially, the DM will set up the beginning of the game, maybe a little recap what happened previously. You'll dive into the adventure. The majority of adventures, and part of the reason why I call my podcast "We Met in a Tavern" start in a tavern. So you meet your adventurers. They lay out a little bit of like a hook, and then it's like, what do you want to do? And then you go around the table and you start a conversation. Anytime, if I say like, I want to order a beer, the bartender says it's 3 gold. I say, that's absurd. Then it's like, okay, roll a charisma check to see if you can get him to come down on the price. And then I roll my dice. And it'll start out with small things like that, but it'll eventually, in the same way story would, unravel into suddenly we're 3 levels deep in a dungeon hunting a dragon, for example. Yeah.
And how does the board, because I've seen like the board, when I played that one time a couple years ago, we didn't involve a board at all, but there is different like structures you put on the board, right, as you go along.
So it is, that is actually one of those that is very table to table, house to house. A lot of people live very heavily in the camp of theater of the mind, in the sense that there would never be a board. You don't need it. I'm 50-50. I think theater of the mind is great, but I also spend a lot of money on miniatures and maps and the ability to lay those things out, because there are rules to combat that having a map, having a board can be a lot more useful for, such as, usually use 5-foot squares as blocks. You have a certain movement speed. Most people are range around 30 feet a turn. So you would use those blocks to figure out like, okay, the monster is 15 feet away from me. I can get there on my turn, hit them, and then get away with my 30 feet of movement. But yeah, you don't need anything too particular. Usually a piece of grid paper is kind of all you really need, which I think is one of the best parts. but it can become as expensive as you want it to be.
I see. Okay, so all that stuff is like supplemental. It's not
Exactly.
totally necessary. Because would you say that there ever been a time, and you don't have to name names or anything like that, but because when you're describing this, it kind of reminds me of when I was a kid. I used to play a lot of GI Joe, and like I had my best buddy, who coincidentally is like an officer in the army now. So we must have done a good job playing GI Joe together. Because he, and my best buddy, we would like we'd choose sides. We'd pick our Joes. We had like we'd pool them all together at the beginning of the day in the summertime. And then we would choose our sides and then go off and build our forts for all morning long. Then after lunch is when the war would commence. And we loved it because we were both on the same page. Like we both understood, like, this is a car or this is a tank. It can't fly, or, this is a, whatever, like, we can't just pick up a pine cone and say it's a bomb. It's like, no, you need to actually have some rhyme and reason to it. And then when I moved away and joined a new neighborhood, I tried to play G.I. Joes with some neighborhood kids, and they have like one of the, an upside down snow cat, and they're making it fly around. And I'm like, what are you doing? And I'm like, so has that ever happened with you when you're playing D&D and somebody's just not, they don't play the same way that you or the rest of the people do? Does it get kind of frustrating in that way?
Yeah, so the big thing there actually is so that's what the guidebooks are helpful for, just for leaning back on, but it also really does, like, in the same way of moving neighborhoods, and suddenly you get to this new group of kids who, they do think pine cones are bombs. It can be table to table, and it's one of the parts I like about the game, because I like board games, I like rule books, but I also like flexibility. And with D&D, one of the best tools you have is your dungeon master, and they can set up a lot of house rules. They also are there to make gut checks, because if you're in the middle of a fight and, for instance, say like, hey, I pick up this bomb and I'm going to throw it, you could probably go through the book and see how realistic that would be, and like, can I really do it? Would that work? But it also kills the pacing. So that's a moment where you look at your DM and your dungeon master makes a call, and one of the kind of the social contract that you have with the dungeon master is like, you accept that they're going to make the most fun game for everyone at the table. They're going to make it fair to a degree, and if we can do it, so can the monsters. Is the other
okay.
But yeah, that's not to say that there aren't pressure points or aren't moments where a ruling doesn't go in everyone's favor, and because of some of that flexibility, there can definitely be some frustration. But I think if it's done right, it actually is what makes it more fun to me than some of the stricter, like Warhammer would be a lot like how you were playing G.I. Joes with your friend, where like it's like, no, I have this tank does what a tank does,
right?
And you all agree on that, and that's great, because like there's no arguing. It's just like, it does what it does.
So it kind of speaks to, I think, the intended audience of all these games. When I played, it was in the suburbs, and I'm imagining that most of the audience of Dungeons and Dragons tended to be kids who lived in, the kind of neighborhoods that were, for lack of a better term, coming of age in the 70s and 80s. And those were those suburban sprawl type zones where you were probably living there because it was close to mom and dad's work, not a heavy commute. It wasn't in the middle of a city. It wasn't out in the middle of a pasture somewhere, as nicely in between. And, roots weren't that deep. It seemed like neighbors kind of came and went in a lot of those kind of communities. And so, when a new family arrives and they're kind of like, the kids are trying to, get a feel for it, they might gravitate towards like, hey, if I'm into basketball, where do kids play basketball? If I'm into, shopping, where's the closest mall? If I'm into playing Dungeons and Dragons, where is that done? Would you say that checks out as far as like the intended audience of the game? Was it predominantly popular, in suburbia more than it was in urban areas?
I think from what I've gathered, it was much more popular in suburbia, and it was primarily because if there was a place where there was a fair amount of kids who had to find something to do with their time and were also left to their own devices. It was in suburbia more than it was in the city. Cities kind of adopted like after school programs a lot earlier than the suburbs did.
Right.
Suburbs, you kind of had like, even I grew up in the 90s, but I was for lack of a better term, a latchkey kid. And,
right. Yeah.
like, yeah, they, my parents loved me, but I definitely was just allowed to do whatever I needed to wanted to do until dinner. And even then after dinner, as long as it wasn't dark, you could stay out.
Yeah.
So I think it worked in that favor. And one of the places where D&D, I think, became pretty popular were public libraries, because the books would become available there.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, so if, again, counterculture, hanging out at the library,
Yeah.
And anybody could go there.
I didn't even think about that as being a factor in it, because I mean, I was one of those people that hung out at libraries mainly because my mom was a preschool teacher, and so she would go be picking up the books, and that was not an appropriate sentence for the son of a teacher to say go be picking up books. She would go and pick up her books for the coming week, and she was so thorough with it. She would spend hours, and so I would go and either I would do my homework, but that usually involved like, this is actually before the internet. So I would go digging around at books that interest me and, get lost. And that's how I fell in love with like rock and roll, is because there's these rock and roll encyclopedias, and it just like seems total counter to rock and roll to read about it, like A for ABBA, it's like, but I would just like get into it. And I know that they had games in the library. My brother and I would play Scrabble sometimes, or whatever. So it does kind of set the feel for a Dungeons and Dragons type setting too. Like I know I never saw anything like that, but across the street was the comic book store, so that might have been where they were going instead to play, was instead of the library to there. But I didn't even think about that as a factor as far as the hubs, pre-internet, I would say. For kids getting ideas about where to go with their stories and what to do with their time. That's a good way of putting it. So moving along with the, I just want to talk about the presentation in media. So I'm actually going to be putting this episode out. I just learned about it recently, that there's a Dungeons and Dragons movie coming out.
There is.
And now so it's coming out at the end of this month. And so I'm going to be putting this episode out just right before it actually screens for the first time. And it's called Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves. And by having the colon and, the subtitle, it makes it seem like it's one of several movies. But to my thinking, they haven't done, I know they had Dungeons and Dragons cartoon in the 80s. I used to watch that, but have they made movies recently out of this?
There was at least one made in the early 2000s. From what I've heard, it was not great, but there's like a little bit of like campy love for it. And I believe there might have been one more before that. Historically, they have not done well. They have not been the best movies, but we're finally in, honestly, the peak of the nerd renaissance that we've had over the last 10 to 15 years. And we're finally at a point where I think we're trusting storytellers and directors to actually just dig in and not be so concerned with like pleasing the masses. We've left blockbuster film, like the idea of a blockbuster, not the video rental company. We left them too, but we left the concept of we left the concept of having like that big summer box office blowout. That's gone because of things like streaming services and more niche media. But I think we're finally at a point where we're like, okay, there's an audience for this. We're gonna make it for that audience, and I've got high hopes for the Dungeons and Dragons movie. From what I've seen from it, they're not taking themselves too seriously. Wizards of the Coast is fully sponsoring it, so we'll see.
Okay, good, because now the screenplay. One of the directors and one of the writers of it is John Francis Daly, who is he played Sam Weir in Freaks and Geeks, which is one of the places where D&D has been represented in media. I would say pretty well. Like they show it's the geeks who are playing it, but in the final episode of the series, one of the greatest character development moments is when Daniel Desario, who's one of the freaks, he's kind of the bad boy in school, gets forced to join the AV club where all of the geeks hang out, and they invite him over to play Dungeons and Dragons. Have you seen that episode?
I haven't, and I'm a big Freaks and Geek fan, so I'm sad that I haven't seen it. But...
And the episode title is called Disco and Dragons because it's about, one of the other characters gets heavily into disco music, and then like I said, Daniel Desario comes over and plays D&D, and when they're pitching it to him, because like they're talking to the character, and they're like, yeah, he's like, you want to come over for Dungeons and Dragons, and one of them's like, what are you doing? Like he's a bad kid, like he's gonna ruin it for us, like he's and he's like, well, what is it? What do you guys do? He's like, well, we just eat junk food and play this game all night. He's like, yeah, that sounds kind of cool, and so he ends up showing up, and he makes I think it's a troll or some kind of dwarf. No, he becomes a dwarf named Carlos, and he wins. He finishes the campaign, and it's a great episode because they don't make fun of Dungeons and Dragons. Mm-hmm. I would imagine that somebody involved in one of the creators, the writers, played the game and understood it and appreciated it. But it's set in 1980, 81, so they are taking part in kind of that subculture, is it good, is it bad kind of thing. But they treat it very well. So when I saw, and actually just now, when I saw that it was John Francis Daly, who is he's like one of the main characters of the show, he must have held that with him then. He must have really appreciated. And maybe, I'm sure, to make it look that much more authentic, that he knew how to play the game, he probably learned how to play it, or maybe knew before, filming Freaks and Geeks. But I think that's kind of appropriate that of anybody who's involved in creating this action adventure movie, that it would be Sam Weir, that he's going to be, part of it.
No, I love that, and honestly, I think I've looked back a lot because D&D came into my life. Probably like 7-8 years ago, but there's a lot of reference to it over time, and certain ones take it more seriously than others. It's the butt of the joke a lot, but in the last 10 years, the amount of people who have come out of the shadows to talk about how like they love D&D, and it was something that they actually always played. A lot of actors who like play it on the side. I want to say like half of the cast of True Blood was all like really into D&D, and they had like a secret game. But it's always really exciting, and and I think it's great for all those people. Like Matthew Lillard's one of those actors who's held onto it, and it's great because they're finally at a point where it's like they can talk about it all the time, and it's also like it's not the counterculture anymore. It's like the culture.
Now, this rarely happens with the EPS podcast. At the time of publishing this episode about Dungeons & Dragons, a new Dungeons & Dragons movie is about to be released. The randomness that is at the core of this show has for once lined up with a current pop culture event. So what does Rob want to see with the new D&D movie? Take a listen.
Dungeons & Dragons, the movie, needs to do to be good is to not just be your run-of-the-mill high fantasy action movie. Like, we have Lord of the Rings, we have Game of Thrones, there are plenty of that content. They need to make sure that this is Dungeons and Dragons, which means it needs to be a little chaotic. The story needs to go in weird places. It needs to be a little bit funny, but it also needs to know when to take a beat and be serious. One of the things that makes the game so great is you can go from making like fart jokes to suddenly like having your best friend rolling death saves, and like the night gets real serious real quick because this character you've played 20 games with is potentially no more. Oh, no. And I feel like if the movie starts playing off of those kinds of beats, the ability to have the story get a little ridiculous, not as formulaic, sometimes things just end and a new story begins. I think if they play with those, I know Deadpool kind of overdid it for a lot of people, but I think there needs to be at least one fourth wall break somewhere. Mm-hmm. We need someone's character to die and then come back and get played by the same actor. I would love to see something to that degree. Or just to begin or end, do like a end slate on people playing at a table.
That's just a short clip from the second part of the episode, which will come out later this year. You can listen to it now, though, by going over to patreon.com or Substack and seeking out the EPS podcast there. Otherwise, thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything, including Dungeons and Dragons, is a primary source. We'll talk to you next time.